Welcome.
Welcome to the Everything Podcast. I am your host, Chuck Manity. And in today's episode, we are going to be covering Love, Death and Robots Season 1 Episode 13 called Lucky 13. The IMDb rating was 7.4 out of 10 with 16,000 reviews. So just a short synopsis. So after the dropship, Lucky 13 lost 2 crew members. No pilot would fly her. But rookies don't get a choice. The directors on this one were Gabriella Peniccioli and Jerome Chen. The writers were Marco Kloos, Philip Gillette and Tim Miller. The stars of this episode were Samira Wiley as Lieutenant Colby, Daisuke Tsuji as Chief Warrant Officer Lee, Nesta Serrano as Major Graham, Stanton Lee as Sergeant Howard, Nashir Dalal as Sergeant Pettibone, Jeffrey Pierce as Private First Class MacDonald, David Palladino as Private First Class Desposito, and Jeff Shine as I-MC. And lastly, it's Melissa Sturm as, let's just say, Itching Betty. So yeah, just some slight trivia here. So Lucky 13 is an adaptation of the Frontlines short stories by Marco Kloos. And yeah, that is basically that. So, without any further ado, let's get right into it. So it opens with the Netflix logo followed by the title sequence. So it opens up with an air wing and the narration from Lieutenant Colby, and Lieutenant Colby is making mention that the rookies have to fly the planes that no one else wants to fly. She makes mention that in her flight group, it is the ship called Lucky 13. She says that there's nothing wrong with Lucky 13 except that she had lost 2 crews previously and they recovered Lucky 13, and this is now the ship that she needs to or has to fly. You see 2 gentlemen busy cleaning the ship, and it has a lot of pieces of dead bodies inside of it, and they're busy cleaning all the blood and bodies from the ship. She finally makes mention that the ship survived, yet the 2 crews didn't, so she said that is unheard of, and that the ship should have at least not survived at least one of those trips, but the ship survived both, which is unheard of, and no crew members. While she's being introduced to the ship, Jacko comes out and he says that he took the liberty of writing Lieutenant Colby's name on the ship. He did make mention that a lot of the guys were superstitious of the ship, and she said that she's not superstitious at all, it's just the machine, to which he scoffs at that remark and says, well, that's what you think. So the first operation she has with the aircraft called 13 is where the enemies attacked one of their terraform stations, so she was front and center with the crew on route to go and eradicate the problem. You get really cool cockpit camera angles within the next couple of shots, and it actually shows you the speed, how fast they're going. It's actually really cool. The 3 ships are flying on an alien planet. It looks very volcanic. You get a lot of these sharp edges on the top of the cliff faces, and it looks quite daunting. It does have a very sort of eerie feel about the planet. It's not very lifelike. This is obviously the reason why they are trying to terraform the place, so that it will make it habitable for human beings. The military team in the back, waiting to leave the ship, and obviously eradicate the problem that is there and what has attacked their terraforming station. The two military gentlemen in the back are making mention that, do you know which ship we're in? And the one comments, we're not in a ship, we're in a coffin. They land very close to the terraforming station. Everyone gets grounded, gets out the ships, and not too long after that they are under attack. The one ship tries to take off without its men, or before the men get back into the ship. She asks, Lieutenant Colby asks him what he's doing. He says he needs to get out of there, and as he says that, the ship and most of the Marines on the ground are shot. Lieutenant Colby, however, makes sure that all her men get back into the ship, and she takes off, and you can see the ships that are attacking them have a very sort of triangular shape and look very, very modern and dangerous. So they notice that there's one more Marine busy running to the ship. Lieutenant Colby is quite brave, so she doesn't leave. She turns the ship around to face the rear of the ship towards where the guy is running to, so that he can obviously get onto the ship easily. But in the meantime, the enemy ships are hot on their tail and on their way to them. The Marine just manages to get into the ship, and they are on a trajectory of falling straight towards the ground. So at this point you realize how good Lieutenant Colby is at flying. She flies into what looks like an underground part of the ground. So the ground at the top is actually not the ground. It's almost like if you had mushrooms in a garden that were so closely packed that it would look like the ground, but there's a hole underneath, or a whole cavity underneath. So she makes her way into that cavity and has to fly really well to make sure she doesn't hit any of the rock face. The enemies are hot in pursuit, and what they realize is that they need to be shooting the columns so that those sort of mushroom top rock faces will fall onto the enemy ships. So Lieutenant Colby tells Jacko to start shooting at the columns. This plan works nicely, and they get rid of one of the enemy ships. They are officially out of ammo, and then there is an enemy ship coming directly towards them. So Lieutenant Colby pulls a monster of a stunt. So what she does is, as soon as she gets close enough, she flies upside down towards them and shoots the flares. Those flares go into the cockpit of the enemy ship, blowing it up and taking it out. So everyone makes it out alive, and you see they are back at the base, and Lieutenant Colby then makes mention that she underestimated or didn't really think that the ship would be as good, and almost apologizes to the ship, saying, I underestimated you. And she makes mention that she has flown 19 successful combat missions with Lucky 13. And in all that time, there was 0 casualties on all of these missions. So the missions have gone uber successfully. One of the higher ups in the military does place an offer on the table for Lieutenant Colby, saying that she could trade in this bucket of bolts for something else, to which she has a smirk, obviously suggesting that this is not going to happen. Lieutenant Colby says that the other people in the military and the flying crew also have said that this is definitely Lucky 13, and now when they're saying the name, they're actually meaning it. And then you see it swaps to a scene where you see Lieutenant Colby getting a tattoo of Lucky 13. It then swaps to a scene where the crew is taking heavy fire, and they're asking where Lucky 13 is, and then Lieutenant Colby arrives, so she puts down some suppressive fire for them to be able to get onto the ship. But this looks a little bit different to how the other ones look. This looks like they're taking a lot of fire, and it looks like they're in a bit of trouble at this point. She gets majority of the crew into the back, and it swaps to a scene where you see an enemy loading what looks like some sort of rocket to be fired at them. It catches Lieutenant Colby by surprise and shoots the left wing. She says to the crew that they need to brace for impact, and then you get a shot of them having a crash landing. Just before I forget, you actually get shots of what looks like the actual ship, so Lucky 13 with its onboard cameras. looking at the crew, it has very high technology where it can actually scan things, and when it scans things, it will say either Lieutenant Colby's name or whoever it's looking at, and scans them as their name. It scans the surroundings. So just after the plane crashes, it does a scan, and I would assume, I don't know that I'm perfectly correct on this one, but I would assume that it's making sure that Lieutenant Colby's okay. Jacko speaks to Lieutenant Colby. He's in the back with the rest of the soldiers, and he then radios to ask if Lieutenant Colby is okay, because she's flying the ship, so she's in the front and in the back with the rest of the team. Lieutenant Colby sees enemies on a ridge, and they are closing in to her and her crew. Lieutenant Colby then activates the cannon to start firing at the enemies, while her team get out of the back and look for a safer place to be, because where they are is not exactly safe. The cannon then malfunctions, and there's quite a bit of enemy soldiers on their way to her. When they're shooting on the glass, you can see it's starting to crack, and the integrity of the glass is getting weaker and weaker. They then fire a cannon similar to, or even the same one that they took the ship down with initially. So they fire a cannon at Lieutenant Colby. She's still in the ship. She doesn't want to leave the ship because the ship's obviously looked after her. Lieutenant Colby activates something in the ship, and she apologizes to the ship, saying that she's very sorry. She makes her way out the ship and is greeted by some enemy soldiers who she shoots at and manages to get away. So at this point you don't know what she's activated, but you can only imagine. You can hear Lieutenant Colby doing a countdown, so it is a self-destruct that she has activated, and as soon as she counts down to 1, 0, the ship doesn't explode, and she looks at the ship in complete shock, saying she doesn't want to go. But it is deeper than that. What the ship actually waits for, and remember I mentioned the scanners, is for all the enemy soldiers, because what they are doing is getting onto the ship, well, not onto the ship, but onto the wings of the ship, behind the ship, on the floor by the ship. So the ship is actually waiting for all of them to populate around itself, and at that point you hear a loud zing, and Lieutenant Colby shouts to her whole crew to get down, and then the ship explodes, killing all of the enemy soldiers. They then walk towards the ship, and you see all these little white lights on the floor, and pieces of the ship. It's almost like I think what they're trying to do is show that this is the soul of the ship. So the ship wasn't a ship as was mentioned by Jacko in the beginning. It was actually almost sentient, even though it wasn't, but that's kind of what it looks like they're going for here, is that the ship, that it's best to look after them. While they're busy walking through the rubble, there's a narration going by Lieutenant Colby, and she makes mention that she got a new Whiskey Blackhawk, and it's the finest ship that you can get at that point. But she says that still she would trade it in a second to fly one more mission with Lucky 13. It ends with a long shot where you see the whole crew in the rubble of Lucky 13 walking around, and then it zooms out to the mountainous area, and then you hear a radio call. Obviously this is the people that are there for the evac, and just after you hear the calls through the radio, you do see the 3 ships en route to evacuate them, and then it ends. So yeah, this one is a lot different to your typical Love, Death and Robots. It didn't have that crazy twist, as in it's a negative twist. It had a kind of a positive good feel spin, even though Lucky 13 didn't make it, but it was a feel good one. So yeah, very different to a lot of the other stuff, which is absolute mayhem, craziness. So yeah, that is that. So if you enjoyed this particular episode of Love, Death and Robots, please do comment that in the comments below. If you enjoyed my review of it, please do also comment that in the comments below. Yeah, so just a few things to look forward to. Obviously Love, Death and Robots, and Ben's just, if you're wondering where Ben is, he's just taking a bit of time off, and yes, he's got some really cool things in the pipeline, for example Avengers comics and the like. So without any further ado, back to this episode. If you like today's episode, please do show us some love by liking, sharing, and subscribing. But that is that for today's episode of the Everything Podcast, and we'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.